Okay, it's 10:45. Hello, you lovely people in the sanctuary and all you Zoom people out there. I think it says there's 10 of you or so. We're glad to have you via Zoom. I'm Jack Brennan. I am your service leader today at the gathering at Northern Hills. And I will start with a few announcements. Sue Klein, Suzanne Bjorner, and Ann Bobinick have got a really good, powerful YouTube monologue video to set up the next second Tuesday discussion, which is on June 14th. It's called Let's Talk About Race, Reflections and Conversations. They all report that it is very enlightening and educational, and hope that people will have time to watch that on YouTube. Suzanne, how should they find that? Contact Sue Klein and she can hook you up. And the second Tuesday discussion again is on June 14th at 7 o'clock. It's a nice tight hour and a very nice way to put an hour into your evening. The rummage sale is coming up quick, June 17th to 18th, and the stream of volunteers has been rather slow, Betsy tells me. So she really could use some volunteers for June 17th and 18th. And I'll do this again. You can, vouchers from our spring auction will soon expire. They're available at half price. 2 admissions to the Cincinnati History Museum expiring June 30th for $16, and 2 admissions to a Florence Y'alls baseball game for $20. You can purchase those from Betsy Anderson. Next Sunday, of course, June 5th, Doug will speak. The title of his message will be For Old Lang Syne, My Friends. And it's going to be a big day. A reception honoring Doug's retirement will be held after the service in the Quimby Room. I think that's all the announcements that really need to be made here today. Think about the Pride celebration on June 25th. MJ Pearson and the Harbinger have details. Our video today that we're going to show is about the proposed 8th UU principle. Suzanne's got me something here for it. I'll just get, okay. This would be an addition to the 7 UU principles. It states, we, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. So it's one step beyond. I think it's the first principle that talks about the integrity of all people, because this, many people think, is really needed. It's an extra step. This video that we're going to see today will educate us all about that. It's Memorial Day weekend, and although I sometimes think our culture wants to glorify nothing else but the military, still, it's Memorial Day weekend. It's the special weekend to honor the service of a lot of brave and courageous people who have fought and died for our country. So I hope everybody will keep that in mind. And with that, I will light the chalice, and I think Michael will get the audio up there. And now we'll have our opening hymn, I'm on my way. It's number 116 in the hymnal. And now we have the unison affirmation, which I hope you will all help us speak. We pledge to create a welcoming community that celebrates human diversity, encourages spiritual growth, fosters responsiveness to our world, and commits to the future of all children. And now we will have the video.
Morning. I'd like to thank Mac and Susan for inviting me to speak with you today. Have enjoyed reconnecting with Reverend Heather, who attended my congregation, UUs of Mount Airy, formerly called Restoration in Philadelphia a number of years ago. Thank you all for being here, both in person and in cyberspace. My name is Bruce Pollock Johnson. My pronouns are he and him. My home in Philadelphia sits on the unceded land of the Lenni Lenape, like here. I'm a cisgender, straight, mentally and mostly physically able-bodied, tall, thin, older, educated, middle-class European American man who has been racialized as white by our society. Virtually all of these identities give me more privilege and access to power. I've tried to leverage my power and privilege to dismantle and redesign the systemic structures that have created these inequalities of resources, opportunities, and power. For example, my partner Linda and I decided to hyphenate our last names when we got married, symbolizing the connection of two equal individuals and we gave our kids the last name of Paulson, P-O-L from her family, Pollock, and S-O-N from my family, Johnson, using the genetic metaphor of each parent contributing to who their children are to encourage systems that are non-sexist and sustainable. I'd like to say that my remarks today start with a simple metaphor. Suppose you were invited to a dinner, and as everyone sat down to their assigned seats, you saw the nice dinner set out for each person with shrimp and chocolate dipped strawberries and other nice things. Suddenly, someone walks in and starts taking individual shrimp and strawberries from the people of color at the table and gives them to the European Americans. Surely you would immediately speak up, stop this blatant unfairness and racism. Now imagine a second scenario. The situation is the same, but this time the redistribution has occurred before everyone arrived. Would you notice? Would you say or do anything? Systemic racism, like other oppressions, carries power largely because it is invisible to those who benefit from it, like in my second scenario. Part of my goal today is to metaphorically show you the video of the redistribution that occurred before we arrived. Unitarianism and Universalism, as we know them, were largely formed in the late 1700s, right around the same time as the United States of America. And so the racism of our Constitution and society was baked into each of them. Unitarianism had origins in Transylvania, Poland, and England, and focused on components like believing that Jesus was a human being, not a god, the importance of freedom of conscience and reason, the rejection of ideas of original sin, and the infallibility of the Bible. Universalists, on the other hand, did not believe that people could end up in hell and believed in an immortal soul, universal love, and working toward building the kingdom of heaven on earth, which we would now call beloved community. I like the following simplified comparison, that Unitarians believe that man, yes, typically expressed in that sexist manner, that man was too good to go to hell, and Universalists believe that God was too good to send man to hell. Yes, they also usually expressed in a sexist form. I think of Unitarians as elite, well-educated thinkers, and the Universalists as more working-class spiritual folks with good hearts. Part of the brilliance of Unitarian Universalism is the merger of these two faiths that recognizes the importance of both the head and the heart in this life. When Europeans first came to this continent, slavery existed in many forms. In this country, usually as indentured servitude, which generally meant servitude for a certain period of time or until a debt was paid off. But it originally had no connection to the color of a person's skin. In the 1600s, there were a number of uprisings, most notably Bacon's Rebellion, where indentured servants of European and African descent worked together against bad working conditions imposed by the elites they served. The elites saw how this endangered their own power, so they devised a brilliant scheme to divide and conquer these two groups. They invented the concept of whiteness, related to the color of one's skin, and gave the poor folks defined to be white power to control those defined not to be white as overseers or enforcers of the hierarchy by threat, fear, terror, and ultimately violence. They pushed the idea that those with darker skin were not equal human beings to whites, or not human beings at all. And therefore, cruelty was justified and encouraged. Even though their conditions may have been even worse for the whites after this new system compared to before, they received the psychological benefit of feeling superior. And that was enough to keep them from cooperating with those they actually had more in common with. Before long, servitude was defined by one's race, this social construction based on skin color, in the form of chattel slavery. Those who were enslaved were the property of their enslavers forever, and so were their children. Laws were passed that any white person could injure, rape, or kill any so-called colored person and could not be prosecuted or punished in any way for it. We see the echoes of that still. Because enslavement was inherited, the slave trade could be ended without ending the institution of slavery, since an enslaver could rape an enslaved woman and the resulting children would also be enslaved. This system of enslavement and forced labor built the wealth of these elites, as well as farmers and businesses in the North and elsewhere, and built the wealth of our country to eventually surpass that of all others. Thomas Jefferson, who many of us claim as a UU, had great ideas about equality, mostly limited to wealthy white men with land, of course, but he did not consider Africans to be equal humans to Europeans, although he wasn't sure whether Native Americans were or not. And despite saying that he would like to free his own slaves, he never did that. And most would say that his siring of children with Sally Hemings could not be described as anything but rape. Some Unitarians and Universalists supported the abolition of slavery, although not necessarily believing in racial equality. But others were on the wrong side of history. After emancipation, chattel slavery was ended, and some progress was made during Reconstruction. But this was soon replaced by the Jim Crow system, whose effect was very similar to enslavement and strengthened the idea and culture of white supremacy. Even the New Deal, Social Security, and the GI Bill, while helping millions of Americans, did not provide the same benefits to people of color that it did to white families. Systemic racism was built into all of them and kept many Black families from being able to accumulate wealth. Unitarians and Universalists did not welcome African Americans as ministers or even members in many places well into the 20th century. And Unitarians were active in the eugenics movement, which contributed to Hitler's atrocities and tried to justify systemic racism. However, during the civil rights movement, things began to change. Many UUs were moved to build relationships with civil rights organizations and then heeded the call to come to Selma after Bloody Sunday. UUs James Reeb and Viola Liuzzo were among the martyrs of the civil rights movement. Around this time, many African Americans joined UU congregations when they saw UUs walking the talk. Later in the 1960s, however, many Black Americans shifted their focus away from the explicit nonviolence of Martin Luther King, especially after his assassination, toward the Black Power movement, heavily influenced by Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, or Kwame Ture, and the Black Panthers. Some UUs were supportive of this shift, and a group called the Black Affairs Council, or BAC, was created to fund Black-initiated projects in Black neighborhoods, organized by the Black UU Caucus, or BUC, and supported by a group of white allies called Fullback. The story is complicated. There were many other feelings in between. And the bottom line was that the General Assembly voted in 1968 to fund BAC at $250,000 per year for 4 years, seen as a form of reparations. But after 1 year of funding, a financial crisis was discovered in the UUA, and no more funding was given after that first year. I call this the Black empowerment betrayal. And after it, many hundreds of Black UUs left the denomination. This crisis was so contentious that there was little racial justice work for a couple of decades in the UUA. Meanwhile, the Jim Crow system that was toppled by the civil rights movement, after some years of good progress, morphed into the war on drugs, the system of mass incarceration, and the school to prison pipeline, what Michelle Alexander has called the new Jim Crow. After the video of the beating of Rodney King, however, in the 1990s, a new movement for racial justice started to build, ending in a number of GA resolutions to become an anti-racist, anti-oppression, multicultural organization. The Journey Toward Wholeness program was created, which included developing the Jubilee anti-racism workshops with Crossroads, providing a common analysis and understanding of systemic racism for thousands of UUs. GAs and other meetings included process observations and right relations teams to hold ourselves accountable and deal with racist comments and actions. We had our first African-American president, and a lot of progress ensued. Sadly, a few years into the new millennium, the commitment to anti-racism waned. Funding for Jubilee workshops ended, and there was a shift in the direction of a much watered down multicultural competence approach. In 2013, Paula Cole Jones, an African-American racial justice consultant and staff person for the UUA, who I guess many of you know, shared an observation with me. She said she had noticed that in her work with UU congregations, there were two categories of congregations, what she characterized as 7 principles congregations and beloved community congregations. The problem in her mind was that many UUs felt that they were living by the 7 principles, but they were totally oblivious to systemic racism. She said, maybe what we need is another principle. Now, I'm the kind of person that responds immediately to a challenge like that. So I stayed up late that night and wrote out an early draft of the 8th principle. I shared it with her, we revised it together, then we worked out final revisions with a post-Jubilee support group we were co-leading at the time. The result was the 8th principle as we now know it. It reads like this: journeying toward spiritual wholeness by building a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. I immediately proposed that my congregation in Philadelphia adopt it as a principle. At that point, we decided to just add the language to our existing congregational covenant in 2014. Later that year in August, in response to the uprising in Ferguson, our congregation started a weekly Black Lives Matter vigil and hung up a banner. Participants in the vigil spend half an hour with signs on the street, then light candles and share readings, songs, and racial justice concerns and history with each other. As many of you know, in 2017, the president of the UUA voluntarily resigned in response to charges of systemic racial bias and insensitivity, even though he himself was Latino, related to hiring practices in the UUA. This crisis led to the formation of the Commission on Institutional Change by our 3 African-American co-presidents and our co-moderator team that included trans folks and people of color. Congregations around the country held white supremacy teach-ins. My congregation responded by adopting the 8th principle overwhelmingly, the first to adopt it, and formed an 8th principle team to implement it. Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism, BLUE, immediately endorsed it, and Honolulu and All Souls DC adopted it soon after. That summer at GA, Paula and I introduced the 8th principle as a responsive resolution, and it passed overwhelmingly. This should have led to the formation of an Article 2 commission to consider the 8th principle and other possible changes to the principle's purposes and sources immediately. But I think the UUA board decided to let the Commission on Institutional Change finish its work before creating that Article 2 commission. The CIC released its report in 2020 called Widening the Circle of Concern, after deeply studying systemic racism in the UUA and making recommendations about how to dismantle it, both in congregations and at the national level. That summer, the Article 2 Commission was formed, and they are hard at work now, aiming to bring a proposal to the General Assembly in 2023. In the meantime, the number of congregations adopting the 8th principle was around 30 about a year ago, It's now over 150. That's out of 1,000 congregations total, including a few UU groups like UU Ministry for the Earth. Why is the eighth principle so important to so many UUs? In the middle of the 20th century, UUism tended to focus on individual freedom and reason. The seventh principle, adopted in 1985, about the interdependent web of life of which we are part, brought more focus on the importance of relationships, gender, and the environment, reflecting a higher level of consciousness in those areas. In a similar way, the eighth principle recognizes the development of a higher level of consciousness related to systemic racism and other oppressions since the 1990s. The resolutions that were passed in the 1990s were not enough to sustain our commitment. Adding it as a principle is the way to make it ever present in the minds of all UUs, to show our true commitment to walk the talk and to hold ourselves and each other accountable to that commitment. I see it as a rebalancing of Unitarianism and Universalism, of head and heart, of individual freedom and collective liberation. Once a month, Paul and I hold gatherings on Zoom of what we call the Eighth Principle Learning Community. For over a year, there have been a couple of hundred UUs on each call, learning from each other, sharing experiences and lessons learned. We have seen how adopting the eighth principle is so meaningful to people of color in a congregation and to young folks who otherwise would be inclined to not bother getting involved in a spiritual community. It's a way of helping us free our movement from its narrow, Eurocentric, and Christian roots to something much more powerful and universal that is appealing to so many people. There's a very good chance that all of the components of the eighth principle will be included in the proposal by the Article 2 Commission, and that it will be adopted. Last year at GA, we proposed a second responsive resolution to affirm that the essential concepts of the eighth principle be included in the principles as opposed to the purposes or sources, which again passed overwhelmingly. But some of the most meaningful work comes from each congregation looking at itself and thinking deeply about how white supremacy culture has inevitably penetrated the way we do things, and making a commitment to doing the hard work needed to dismantle that embedded systemic racism. My personal goal is to have almost all of our congregations adopt the eighth principle before the first GA vote in 2023. Then the national vote will have deep meaning, and we will have truly transformed ourselves. Theologically, there's been a movement in UUism from individual freedom toward collective liberation. Many of us talk about beloved community as our vision for where we want to go. We talk about the importance of love, but that word is not yet contained in our principles. Spiritually, racism and other oppressions damage the souls of all of us, both the oppressed and the oppressor. Knowing we have benefited from something we do not deserve is painful and damages our soul. If we want to become whole spiritually, we need to do this work to repair that injustice. I see the eighth principle as a rebalancing, as I mentioned before, of Unitarianism and Universalism. The eighth principle focuses on racism because that has been the source of our two major crises as a denomination, the one in the late 60s and the resignation in 2017. Theologian James Cone has called racism America's original sin. Of course, we UUs don't believe in original sin, but we can understand his point. At the same time, similar dynamics can affect LGBTQIA+ folks, people with disabilities, women, and many other groups. We want to work toward beloved community where every person feels at home, respected, accepted, and loved for who they are at their core. Our music, habits, and cultural awareness can have a huge effect on whether this happens or not for other folks. The eighth principle is a beacon helping us see the path toward this goal. The Widening the Circle report is an initial roadmap of ways to get there. And the idea of the eighth principle is to sustain that commitment, not just pass a resolution and move on to the next issue. Now that I have shown you the video of the redistribution that occurred before we got to the dinner table, I trust that you will be moved to do something about that injustice. Don't get stuck in guilt. Guilt is simply awareness without action. The remedy is simple: take action. We all have been tainted by decades of socialization in a racist society. It's time to do something about it. I hope that all of you at UUs of Southern Delaware will think about and discuss the implications of adopting the eighth principle deeply. I wish you well in your journey, and I'm happy to be helpful in any way I can. May it be so.
Well, so I guess adopting that as a congregation may be on the table for us here in the coming weeks and months. I don't know if this was on the schedule, but does anybody have a comment or any take on that? What you just saw?
Come up to the microphone if you do.
I used to belong to the DC church, the All Souls Church that adopted it early on. I have a good friend who was part of the group that moved through it. And it's a very integrated neighborhood. It's downtown DC. When we were there, it was a very low income area. It's changed over time. But one of the things that was most interesting about it is that the process that they went through included bringing in other churches to talk about it and how did it translate across other neighborhood churches as well. And they had a very charismatic minister. And so it's been really interesting to watch them. I mean, they absolutely did it right off the bat. They were one of the really early adopters, but they did it themselves. And then they had a plan to help others talk about it too. And I thought that was just such an interesting twist on it. So as we get into that conversation, I hope we do that too.
Thanks, Lindsay.
We have Andrea on Zoom who wants to say something. Andrea, if you want to unmute yourself, please.
Yeah, hi, everybody. I guess I'm not clear on what the eighth principle is. So if somebody could put it in, I'll say, yeah, I'm just not clear on it. If somebody could re-explain it.
I think it's just a directed focus on dismantling racism. It's just a specific focus on that as opposed to just it being included in everything else. It's just a shift of focus. That's how I interpret it, at least.
Yeah, as I said, as I understand it, it was an emphasis that taking the first principle about the integrity of all people, taking it one step farther in light of the awareness people are gaining about systemic racism and institutional bias.
Yeah, I guess so. Well, I guess it'll come up more. I'm just not sure what that means for us as a congregation.
We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. And Andy, just, oh, where'd she go? There she is. I think that one of the things, hi dear, one of the things that early on he mentioned about one of his colleagues' observations that there were the beloved community congregations and the 7 principal congregations, and that they each were wonderful congregations, but that some of them were so focused inwardly that they didn't necessarily see how that carried on habits of exclusion or racism that fell into the category of the results of systemic racism. And I actually think results of systemic racism is an interesting element of it, because when you look at the laws about who could get a mortgage and how you could do it, and the Social Security piece, I mean, there truly were laws on the books that created systemic racism. While many of those have been corrected, the results of that are what we're living with now. The lack of equity that many Black families have built up over generations, the sense that they didn't have the same opportunities is in many cases very true. So I think it's more about the results that we all still live in. And I think the point behind the principle is to elevate it to a place where on a regular basis, we think about how what we take for granted, others don't have, and how we can correct it.
Okay, thanks.
I'm Suzanne Bjorner. I've been looking at the 8th principle for a while now, and I will say that I've been troubled by it. There are things I don't like about it. I'll tell you exactly what it is I don't like about it. The language. I find the language clumsy and imprecise. That doesn't mean that I don't appreciate and approve of the intent of the 8th principle. So I was encouraged by the video that we saw this morning, because it sort of gives a way out to me, to my thinking anyway. I mean, I certainly would not want to reject a principle based upon, well, I wouldn't want to adopt a principle unless some words, unless there was some word tinkering going on, okay? And I realize that at least 2 people did do that, but I'm not sure that 2 people did, that more than 2 people did that. What the speaker said today is he brought it into the context of the Article 2 revision, which is a broader revision, which has been going on and which I became aware of when I attended virtually GA the last couple of years. I have the feeling that the Article 2 revision or proposal will come back with something that will encompass the 8th principle, but perhaps say it in a better way. I mean, for one thing, the 8th principle as it stands now is about 4 times longer than any of the other principles. It's just awkward. And remembering what we went through in our congregation with the unison affirmation, that we wanted to have a unison affirmation that children especially, but people also could say succinctly. So I guess what I'm saying is that I certainly approve of the intent of the 8th principle. I think it would be a fine idea for this congregation to take it under consideration to see whether we want to adopt it. And I am hoping that when the Article 2 revisions are proposed, which will be in 2023, that it will be incorporated and said better. We could have a part in helping that be said better, perhaps. I don't know.
Joel Arugio. Anybody else out there on Zoom would like to comment? I guess not. I'll just say, Suzanne, I realize now what you meant about it being clumsy and long, because as I was trying to read it in the opening, I was kind of like, well, what am I saying here? When are we going to get to the point? Where's the meat in this? So I after you saying that, I agree with that. Yeah. So now we have a musical reflection, changes.
Mel wants to share.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I got you confused with taking the collection, Mel. Okay, go right ahead.
I know that's usually my role, but now the one thing I would like to say, and that is that many of us just don't understand from the perspective of people of color. And that is a problem. It certainly was a problem on the issue of the Black Lives Matter banner, but going forward from there, I think this is something that we really need to engage the thoughts on how we can have a more beloved community, but we need it from the perspective of people of color, along with our own, just so we have a more robust perspective in coming up with an eighth principle. And I guess that's pretty much what I want to say, is that we need the input of people of color, even those that are not UU. But thank you.
Thanks, Mel. And now I guess we move on to the musical reflection. A change is going to come. Sam Cooke.
I can't sing as well as Sam Cooke. I'm sorry. I'm gonna try though. I was born by the river in a little town. Oh, just like that river, I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming, but I know change is gonna come. Oh, yes, it will. It's been too hard living, but I'm afraid to die, 'cause I don't know what's there beyond the sky. It's been a long coming, but I know change is gonna come. Oh, yes, it will. I go to the movie, I go downtown. Somebody telling me don't hang around. It's been a long time coming, but I know change is gonna come. Oh, yes, it will. Then I go to my brother and I say, brother, won't you help me please? But he winds up and he's knocking me down, down on my knees. Oh, there's been times that I thought I couldn't last for long, but now I'm able to carry on. It's been a long time coming, but I know change is gonna come. Oh, yes, it will. And I know change is gonna come. Oh, yes, it will. And I know change is gonna come. Oh, yes, it will.
Thanks, Michael. I didn't realize that was going to be live when I was introducing it. And now we have our offering to give from our wealth to the good work that GNH does. It's joys and sorrows time here. Do we need a mic set up?
We sure do. Sorry, just forgot about it. You want to share? Come up to the mic, please.
I just want to remind everybody that next Sunday is our retirement party for Doug. He is still speaking on the 12th, but tomorrow, next Sunday is the party. And I have brought with me today a whole collection of cards. And for those of you on Zoom, they'll be in the office. So you're welcome to come by and write one out. But they're just well wishes for Doug. And what we want to do is have a big basket of them. So when you leave today, or even when you're sitting in the Quimby room, if you can take just a few minutes and write one up, then we'll put them in the basket and Adrian will start collecting them. And for you at home, if you don't have time to come by the church, just any card, send in, and Adrian will collect them all and we'll give them to him next week as part of our gift. So, and I hope you'll all be there. So if you would please RSVP, just call Adrian or send in an email because we just need to know for numbers for the food. Thank you.
Got Andrew on Zoom, and real quick, Joel just shared that Crosley celebrated her 6th birthday this week. 6 already.
Happy birthday. Oh, yeah, I just, we had planned, this is the second year in a row, our Memorial Day has been, plans have been crashed by health issues. This year, my two sons were coming in, one for a bar mitzvah for a friend's daughter, and then our other son was coming in just to visit. And anyway, the long story short, the younger son had been at a medical conference in New Orleans before he got here. And when he got here, he tested positive for COVID. So he's now isolating and in a bedroom in our house, and we're wearing masks around him. But on the one hand, it's nice to have him here. You know, so, and he said he's glad he's here because it's quiet. And he said it's almost like being off from school for being sick. But it may interfere with plans he had for the next weekend, which was a friend's wedding. But so I debated coming in. I was getting ready, and my husband said, well, maybe you shouldn't go in because we've been exposed. So I didn't come in today, but I do plan on coming to the party next week. But anyway, he's young and healthy, and I think he's going to be okay. But COVID's still alive and well. So anyway, and he'll be fine, and I think we'll be fine as well. But that's all. Thanks.
Thanks for sharing.
Our grandson graduated last week, and we loved Ann McCracken's comment on Facebook, which said, "Congratulations congratulations to On and his village." And it did take a village to help him going on being at our house when the COVID, they were on Zoom. Marty Spees was a help when we'd say, what should we do? How can we help him? Kind of thing. So it did take a village, but he did it. He's excited, and we're excited.
Andy, I'm sorry to hear about your son, but I'm excited about seeing you next week. So that'll be great. 2 things. One is I wanted to mention that I heard from Linda Gutowski, and her stepfather is back in the hospital with a gallbladder blockage. So please keep him and her and her family in your thoughts and prayers. And also, I just learned, and I'm sad to hear it, that Bob Freer is going to be leaving us permanently on June 7th. He's flying to California to be with his son. So we'll see him this week and next Sunday. And we're happy that we're going to see you then. So we'll miss you.
Yeah, I think next Sunday is a little bit of a farewell to Bob party too, if we can slide that in there. And I'll just add one here. I don't know. It's just a joy to me. And I thank Betsy and Bev for just being here every week, setting up Becky, I'm sorry, I get Betsy and Becky, setting up the hospitality for everyone. Thank you very much. And our closing hymn is Guide My Feet, number 348.
This rest in
And I got some closing words here. I think it ties into what we've been talking about today. It's a quote. It's kind of an ugly quote, but it struck me when I was doing some reading lately, and I thought it illustrated just the depth of the bias and prejudice that we're all facing today, 160 years after the Civil War. This was spoken by a guy named Fernando Wood. He was a Northern guy. He was a mayor of New York, and he was also then in the U.S. House. And he was speaking in the U.S. House against the adoption of the 14th Amendment, which granted full civil rights to the emancipated slaves. And again, this is kind of ugly, but I think it's worth hearing. He said on the floor of the House, "We may amend the Constitution. We may, by superior military force, overrun and conquer the South. We may lay waste their lands and destroy their property. We may free their slaves. But there is one thing we cannot do. We cannot violate with impunity or alter the laws of God. The Almighty has fixed the distinction of the races. The Almighty has made the black man inferior. And sir, by no revolution, by no military power, can you wipe out this distinction. You may make the black man free, but when you have done that, what have you done?" Thank you for coming, everyone, this morning.